All right, after some mild technical delays, I think we're ready to get started. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Michael Lynch. I'm the director of the Humanities Institute here at the University of Connecticut, and I'm the PI, the principal investigator of Humility and Conviction in Public Life, which is a research and engagement project based here at UConn. And that project is aimed at trying to figure out how to recapture meaningful public discourse in this country, democracy. The name of the project, Humility and Conviction in Public Life, reflects a fundamental tension, I think, facing any such effort. Democracies need passionate citizens, we all know that, I hope, but they also need to listen to each other, be willing to respond with reasons. Now, as the week's events have shown me, it's hard to do both. The human condition shows that too. It's hard to stand up for what you believe in, but also listen to the other side. Indeed, speaking for just myself, I have, I think, never felt the tension between these two fundamental goals of democracy more clearly than this week. But here's the thing. We still must do our best to resolve this tension if the ideal of our republic is to survive. And for that, we're going to need courage. Courage to stand up to oppression, courage to fight authoritarianism, courage to speak out for and on behalf of the most vulnerable. But courage also to look at what we've misunderstood, to realize that we too don't know it all. But courage is also not enough, I think. We also need the means. And the crucial means for change in democracy is discourse in all its forms. And one thing is clear, public discourse in our country is shattered. We now disagree not only over values, not only over facts, we disagree over what a fact is. We are living, forget echo chambers. We're living in separate epistemic realities, separate spheres of reasons. So tonight, I'm happy to welcome you here to join with our panelists to start the process of thinking how we can pick up the pieces of our shattered public discourse. It's just going to be a start. Allow me to introduce our panelists. And first, I want to begin with our two faculty experts who are here to engage in this discussion with you. Professor Mick McElya is currently an associate professor in the history department. Her research concerns radicalism and social change. One of you join us up on the up in front. Professor McElya's expertise concerns radicalism and social change, military culture, capitalism, and emotional economies of the 20th century. She received her PhD from New York University in 2003 and has taught at the University of Alabama. Her first book, Clinging to Mammy, won a 2007 Outstanding Book Award from the Gustavus Myers Center for the Study of Bigotry and Human Rights. She is named the top young historian by the History News Network in 2008, and her current book is The Politics of Mourning, Death and Honor in Arlington National Cemetery. That's just out now. It's excellent, if I say so myself. And I do. Professor Evelyn Simien is currently associate professor with the Department of She's also a member of the Institute for Africana Studies. Her first two books are Black Feminist Voices in Politics in 2006, which examined Black feminist consciousness and its effect on political behavior, and Gender and Lynching, The Politics of Memory in 2011. Her most recent book is Historic Firsts, How Symbolic Empowerment Changes U.S. Politics, from Oxford in 2015, just last year. And that book considers whether candidates from Shirley Chisholm in 1972 to Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama mobilized voters through emotional appeals while combating stereotypes, providing more inclusive representation. A very pertinent topic, I think you would agree with me, for tonight's discussion. Finally, I want to introduce our special guest to the university tonight, Alexander Heffner. Alexander is the host of The Open Mind on PBS, which is, I believe, the longest running television show in history. 60 years, although you have not personally for 60 years. He has covered American politics, civic life, and the millennials since the 2008 presidential campaign. His work has been profiled in many, many different publications, from Variety, Medium, the LA Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, on every major television network here in abroad. He's written for the New Yorker, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, et cetera. And he's lectured throughout the country on many of the issues that we're going to be talking about tonight. And as host of the Open Mind, I thought he was the perfect person to be here to kick us off. What's going to happen is we're going to let turn the microphone here over to Alexander, who will say some remarks. Then we'll move right into a panel discussion with our faculty experts. And then we're going to turn it over to you guys, and we'll have some Q&A. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Alexander Heffner.
Thank you all for being here. It's an honor to speak with you tonight. These are historic times, to be sure. And I want to talk a little bit about my experience during this primary campaign and general election cycle. It started for me at Franklin Pierce, where I was a fellow, the Fitzwater Fellow, at the Center for Public Leadership and Communication in Ringe, New Hampshire. And the mandate of the Fitzwater Center is to instill values of public good and conscience into the minds of young people. And our proposal was rather simple, representing PBS and having a nationally distributed show. We worked with New Hampshire PBS to develop a project called Primary Dialogue. And Primary Dialogue was intended to be a conversation with the Republican and Democratic candidates and any independents who would agree to a truly open discourse. And this was at the early stages in the fall of last year, before the First in the Nation primary in New Hampshire and before the First in the Nation caucus, the first Democratic contest of any kind. And our goal was to try to widen the discourse, to empower disparate voices that needed to be heard in unison with some cross-pollination, some tolerance of difference, and some ultimately consensus. And we thought around that kind of Socratic table with which a lot of you young people are familiar, there could be genuine exchange of ideas. So we produced letters to the campaigns and candidates, and we invited all the announced, declared presidential candidates. At the time, they included Governor Bush, Senator Rubio, among almost 24 other Republicans, and we were willing to do this in stages too. On the Democratic side, there were fewer candidates, but we invited all of them, from Secretary Clinton to Senator Sanders to law professor Larry Lessig. And we got buy-in from the professor. We got buy-in from some of the lesser-known Republican candidates, but shortly everyone was reminded that the DNC and the RNC would disqualify any of our participants if they wanted to share the stage with someone with whom they disagree. They could not participate in our primary dialogue. And I wrote a piece on Real Clear Politics that you can Google, emanating from this experience called Trickle-Down Discourse. But it really, in my mind, epitomizes the extent to which we began this campaign with some elimination of rationality, some elimination of conviction, some elimination of those two really useful constructs and frameworks that the Institute celebrates, humility and conviction, the idea that we could have an exchange of ideas from which these candidates could genuinely learn. And I think that that really speaks to the failure of the primary election system in engendering the kind of discourse that I know Michael champions and that I'm sure a lot of you, Democrat or Republican, want to believe is plausible in what seemed like an increasingly no good, terrible election cycle in which the discourse was in the gutter. There were candidates who were more willing to embrace, if not completely deploy, the kind of rhetoric that would further fuse that kind of echo chamber of group thought and even hate. And so fast forward to through the primary campaigns through which we were really entertained as a result of much of the coverage which focused entirely on President-elect Trump and his career and his confounding the expectations of the pundits and his natural charisma, appeal to a wide swath of the disenfranchised, disaffected, as Van Jones said on CNN's election night analysis, the white lash that we saw evident in a huge majority of white Americans feeling betrayed by these last 8 years. My participation in that phase of the election was largely as host of the Open Mind, inviting folks like Michael and others to engage in discourse. I did have Senator Sanders on my program pre-campaign announcement in which he fleshed out his vision for his campaign. But when we were so paralyzed in the gridlock of a Republican primary and Democratic primary that really do insulate us, that morph us into Earthlings and Martians, and you can say whether Democrats or Republicans are the Martians, or which is the American electorate with which you have familiarity, based on the popular vote and the Electoral College, is deeply divided. But we were not able to reconcile in a mainstream media discourse the tensions. The fact that really both Senator Sanders and President-elect Trump were speaking to the economic malaise, the blue-collar angst, and for any of you who are citing an exit poll survey that shows that no 50 to 100K income earners were Donald Trump's bread and butter, it's not economic issues, try to raise a family on 50 to 100K as a young millennial and realize that there were some real economic forces as well as cultural ones shaping the surge of these upstart anti-establishment candidacies of both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. So fast forward to the general election campaign and deliberative democracy that we aspire to produce in the rigorous debates and the Oppo research and the WikiLeaks and the Access Hollywood video and the sentiment of racism, xenophobia, bigotry, and the deployment of two opposite visions of the country in many respects, backed up by identity politics, one of pluralism, diversity, one of more division, divisiveness. And you see what I've talked about for the last 2 months, from college campus to high school campus to middle school students at an all women's and girls school that I spoke to the day of and the day after the election in New York City. What you see is this vicious cycle of incivility as being the operating philosophy that our politics has adopted, and that is seeming bigotry, seeming obstructionism, and seeming political correctness. And I talk at length, and I'm going to expound happily, if asked, on this vicious cycle of incivility. But I said on Twitter, in responding to the publicity around this evening, that civility is still alive because I saw today something that inspired me, and that was President Obama and President-elect Trump in the process of transfer of power, having an hour and a half meeting and speaking to each other reasonably, diplomatically, even with a complimentary and respectful demeanor, which of course contradicts everything that we saw during the campaign and a lot of the bigotry that was fueling the rise of Donald Trump, at least in the alt-right media. But this cycle of incivility, and I call it that because I think the basis on which we live is civilization or some kind of civilized democracy. But that vicious cycle is not just with respect to this campaign. That vicious cycle is with respect to the way that Congress obstructed because it disagreed with the president, whether it's on the Supreme Court nominee or other things put forward by the president that were denied even legitimacy. It is in the hate speech from Trump, but also the contention that all of Donald Trump's supporters, or even half of them, are deplorable. And it manifests itself in this idea that if you're bigoted, and I think this is a true idea, that you have really little to gain from that public discourse. And if you start from that position, you're not willing to listen to your brother and your sister, your neighbor, your peer, then it lends itself to a kind of obstruction of thought. And I think it culminates in this idea of the status quo, or political correctness, which in no way justifies, to my mind, ad hominem attacks, hate speech, bigotry. Along with Michael's book that I encourage you to read if you haven't, you ought to get a hold of The Politics of Resentment by Kathy Kramer, a political scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who was as prescient as Michael was with the lack of reason, rational, coherent discourse. That is, anything can follow a contradiction. Kathy's book speaks to the politics of resentment, the causal relationship between failed public policy and the idea that if you're in rural Wisconsin, where she studied these communities of disaffection, that you blame people of color or affirmative action, and you blame the government as being the vehicle of social good, not for you, but for the other. And it is in this that we find that tension. I don't know how many more minutes I have. 5 more minutes, okay, good. So I'll try to connect these dots now of incivility, because I saw the appearance of civility today in the discourse and in the behavior of the outgoing and incoming president. And that is a sign of hope, of real aspiration, the potential to realize some compromise, some degree of compromise, possibly in the days and weeks to come. And I conclude by saying this. In the last 48 hours, 24 hours, I spoke to, in random conversations, a number of Trump supporters, and found them to be not mirroring the stereotype that would probably be portrayed in a lot of university contexts. Having said that, 2 months ago I was in Dayton, Ohio, when a millennial, a 20-something, said that while he had never heard the N-word at the University of Northern Kentucky, he was transferring to Wright State. His new roommates were using that language in a derogatory context, as it only is in that setting of kind of beyond the pale, beyond the frat house, in not only speaking about the president that way, but other people of color in a disparaging manner who they might dislike or dislike something they're doing. And that was, of course, awfully disheartening and represented some real element of truth in what Secretary Clinton was saying. So it's, again, the question of how you rationalize the behavior that is inconsistent with your values, and that is a very extreme example. But in the conversations that I had with some Trump supporters, it was clear that there was a divergence in values too, but it wasn't explicit. It wasn't partisan per se. Some of it focused very much on the flaws of the Democratic Party's nominee. I think that we, and Seth Meyers had a really brilliant, soothing, empathetic speech, if you want to call it that, on late night last night or the night before, and acknowledging the authentic feelings that led to a President Obama and now a President-elect Trump. And those are real. Those have to be analyzed, interrogated, honed in on, understood in a way that does not ever justify political violence. And that really is the fear that the incivility in the rhetoric that was part of that vicious cycle to begin with is not going to culminate now in a political correctness. It's going to culminate in a political violence. And so it's so necessary now not to wipe the slate clean, but to understand that there has been political violence in our history, there's been bigotry in our history, and to be extraordinarily watchful that that is not further harming public discourse beyond the coarsening of what we've already seen. But I will just say that it is that question of how much intolerance are you prepared to tolerate, and what is intolerance, and what is civility. And on that note of raising some of these unanswerable questions when you find it deeply, profoundly difficult to rationalize some of the words of our president to be, I want to hand the mic over to Michael, who's going to moderate a discussion with us. And thank you for your attention tonight.
Thank you very much. All right, so we have a lot to digest, and let me just lower that a bit. So we just heard from the host of the Open Mind, and Hillary Clinton, in her concession remarks, said the other day that, I mean, I don't know about you, just as an aside, the last 36 hours, whatever it's been a blur for me, so I'm not sure when it was, right? But she said that we needed to remember to fight for the rule of law, but also we needed to keep an open mind. And what I wanted to turn to Mickey and Evelyn, and maybe we start with you. Do you agree with that, and what does that even mean in this context, do you think?
I wish I could answer that right now, because I'm not sure what an open mind looks like in this context. I appreciate the call for it. I appreciate the very real, sort of the hopeful moments that you were describing earlier of Obama and Trump making the exchange of power, the theater of a nonviolent exchange of power to come. Although we were talking earlier, I would have loved to have heard what Melania and Michelle were talking about when Michelle Obama was giving her tour of the White House today. And I've thought about that a lot, because also, how do you look one another in the face after the kinds of things that have been said in these contexts and the kinds of things that have been said about you? And I think one of the really critical things that we can't leave out of this conversation is that this is about misogyny, this is about homophobia, this is about Islamophobia, this is about racism of various stripes, this is about a language that has encouraged the worst possible ways to interact as human beings, and called that politics, and called that the American promise, and the way to the American promise for segments of the population that believe they found voice in Donald Trump. And I think partially what they found voice for was incredible hate. So I don't know how I stand with an open mind and negotiate those politics and negotiate those conversations. And I look to the grace that I believe Hillary Clinton showed in trying to start that conversation. I look to the grace of the Obamas, and I look to the very real, and in some ways a moment that I have to wonder about, I think the grace that Trump tried to demonstrate after his conversation. Right? That is this moment. And I really, what do we do in terms of humility and conviction when you have one person who has no humility and has built a persona, career, wealth, and political power out of a failure of humility, and another side where humility is so gendered and so profoundly shaping how we receive her, that the expectation is if you're a woman, you will be humble, you will show humility to everybody else in the room. And so to inhabit that space in a way that isn't constantly aware of how you're being perceived and how you're presenting yourself in gender dynamic, racial dynamic, sexual dynamic, class dynamic, I think it's really problematic. So it's not, I have no answer because I'm so struggling with how to get there.
Evelyn, do you want to jump in on this?
Well, I hear her say to us, give the man the benefit of the doubt. But the theme, the theme tonight is sort of picking up the pieces, which would suggest we're all pretty broken, fractured, and divided. And immediately when I think about her concession speech and her humility, her presence, she showed so much grace in that period that I felt that it was a call almost to forgive. It's like once you have been wronged, you have to dig pretty deep in order to find a place from which you can forgive and show mercy to the other human being that you feel has so wronged you in all the ways that you sort of enumerate and highlight in your remarks. It takes a certain type of person to sort of turn the other cheek and not confront an election, an electoral outcome such as this one, and not respond with violence on account of your dismay, your anger, these heartfelt emotions. When you play the tape back and think about the words that have been spoken, it's not unlike any relationship you've been in, where someone has expressed some very deep, hurtful words, and you think about what they said to you a week later, a month later, perhaps 6 months, years later, and you can choose to either hold on to that and sort of be stuck in that place, or you can let it go. Because honestly, we're in a place where it is what it is. We are not in a position to change the electoral outcome. We can't go back in time, though we may like to. We have to think moving forward, what could I have done differently? I voted, but did I take someone a ride to a poll? You know, pundit after pundit has said Hillary Clinton, quote unquote, underperformed. So in what way may I have contributed or not performed in a capacity for which I may have helped her campaign. Some of us may have stayed home, whereas others may have made it to the ballot box. But post-election, we have to think about how do I, as a citizen, sort of hold up my end of the bargain and perform in a way that I can be proud of. You know, honestly, I said, hell, I want to run for office. After an election like this, I'm like,
I might vote.
Yeah.
what should
We'll
and
help.
could I do? Do I need to run for office?
2020.
Yeah, I called my stepmother and I said, you know, because she's in contemplating the same idea.
Yeah.
You know, after election night, I was speaking to high school women in New York City, many of whom were tearing up, bawling, or their faculty, or even the head of school, who introduced me, gave a very moving introduction, was attempting to soothe these young women, but it was a harsh reality, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but I second that notion that politics begins the day after. In so many ways that young people are utterly dismissive of or just not cognizant of. And that is really the story of the margins. Speaking as someone who's covered the youth vote the last several election cycles, President Obama won 18 to 30-year-olds by a 2/3 majority, a healthy majority in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, those battlegrounds. And you have to gain the electoral science because of the fact that the popular vote doesn't dictate the outcome. So one of the things I said to these young women, who were 9 through 12 in high school, I said, if there are aspects of American democracy that are unfair, like the Electoral College, like gerrymandering, which is a kind of, or voter suppression, which is a kind of rigging that, for whatever reason, the Secretary did not acknowledge during the campaign, then you have to take up arms. And those deficits of democracy, and they're anti-democratic and institutionalized from state house to state house, because of a federalist system under which we live, those are just as dominant a force in influencing outcomes of the presidential elections as anything else. So it is unfair that a majority vote doesn't rule the House of Representatives, and it doesn't rule the presidency, and now the Republicans have control of all branches of government, and yet they had a minority of voices. But you have to not protest Trump Tower the day after this election because the Electoral College has been around since our infancy and our founding. You have to go out and reform. You have to run for office. And you have to, that involves a persuasion campaign, that involves public relations, that involves strategy, that involves reform, and that involves all of you. And of course, not only were those margins diminished among 18 to 30-year-old voters, they just didn't come out. Those Bernie or bust people really did bust. And just one final thing is, one thing I missed in the presentation was just, you had those incivilities, but underlying all of those incivilities is really the incivility of inequity between the city and the suburb, between the wealthy and the poor, that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump spoke to profoundly. And that was really the narrative of this campaign. And that overrode the incivility of bigotry or of the idea of obstructionism or even political correctness, I think.
Well, let me pick up on that, and also I think something that Evelyn, I think you were Evelyn, you used this metaphor of a relationship, which I think is really interesting and really hit me, because to me it seems like, I don't know about the rest of you, but I talked about, living in this sort of daze in the last few days, but also feeling like, yeah, in a sense that we've been, for the last, well, 2 years really, seemingly living in like an abusive relationship with our own electoral politics, right? And feeling like the person that just keeps coming back for more punishment, by checking my social media. But that also metaphor hits because, look, some of the most toxic rhetoric in this campaign was about race and gender and transgender. I could go on. And we can't ignore that. But we also have to, and this is now touching on what you were bringing up, we also, it seems to me, can't ignore the fact that for many people, including many women who voted for Donald Trump, they were willing to overlook that discourse. We were talking about discourse, as you said. So I'd be interested to hear what, you were just touching on this, what you guys think about how do we explain that? And should we explain it, or in the business of explaining it, or just dealing with it? What do we have to say about that?
I had this conversation in my office. Because immediately following the next day, a lot of the papers talked about the poll having failed to predict the outcome. And I was on a panel the next day, and I had a critique of the poll, and I said, it comes down to the type of questions we're asking. Had we measured gender attitudes? Had we measured attitudes toward race? I think we would have done a better job of predicting the outcome of this election. And some political scientists will do it in the aftermath, that is, look for a relationship or correlation between conservative gender-based attitudes and one's likeliness to vote for a woman as their commander-in-chief. The news pundits focused on a message, an economic message, as being the reason for Trump's victory. But I think if we were to look at women, not as a monolith, but as a diverse group, there are those who are going to be feminists that, upon hearing the audio tape of Trump's language and discourse regarding women as sexual objects, they will hear that language and immediately shriek and feel this is assaultive, that at a minimum it qualifies as sexual harassment, if not outright violence against women. There's another demographic of women that will reduce it to, much like his wife, locker room talk. And I think that marks a fundamental difference in terms of attitudes, specifically feminist attitudes. And it requires more consciousness raising, I think, among women to then be able to identify what is assaultive speech, what is vile, what is a physical threat to us. And it goes beyond mere locker room talk, which still in and of itself should be declared unacceptable in any context or form of the imagination. I get a little, I get a little riled up.
So do we all. Mickey, did you
No, and I agree with this, and I think not only were some of the questions the wrong questions to ask, or not necessarily wrong questions, but incomplete questions to ask in terms of getting at this information. But I think we actually have to think about the way we're categorizing this information as well. So I had to bring little cheat sheet notes with my numbers on it because I was afraid I'd mess them up. But this is sort of the numbers that were reported the next day about votes for Donald Trump among white women and then differentiated by college education, right? And one of the things we've heard consistently across reporting along this election, the election night, but also leading up to it, was the college-educated white vote versus the non-college educated vote. And this was to stand in for a variety of class distinctions, a variety of regional distinctions, and it does an enormous amount of disservice to those distinctions because it allows us not to talk about economic inequality, but to offset that onto education, and not to suggest that we need to talk about educational inequalities, student loan debt, the kind of variable access to education that we're looking at in this country, but instead suggests somehow that we're talking about smart versus stupid people. And that is a huge problem in terms of trying to understand, if we're going to have an open mind and find common ground, then one of the first things we need to do is actually retreat from that kind of language and start to look at these different factors, all the factors we all explain. But the other piece of it is I think we can't deny that this was a repudiation of feminism. This was a repudiation of a feminist woman who has a long history in this is specious, and I obviously I put scare quotes around it, I say all these things. Second wave is a terrible categorization to describe change over time in the history of feminism, but this is one of our leading so-called second wave feminists in the United States who's had a huge impact on politics, and this is partially about saying, we don't want that in the office. And the numbers are 45% college-educated white women voted for Donald Trump, 49% of college-educated white voters overall voted for Donald Trump in these figures, and 53% of all white women. So we take the college-educated moniker out. I don't think this is about just voting for a woman because she's a woman and it's an affirmation of women in politics. Although I do believe that the more women we see in politics, and even seeing Hillary Clinton run or seeing Shirley Chisholm run, we don't talk about Shirley Chisholm enough. Shirley Chisholm should be a part of this conversation. 1972, first black woman elected to Congress in the late 1960s, which we need to have a long conversation about that. How does that happen historically in this country? And then in 1972 becomes the first black woman to run for president for a major party. From the reforms that were made after '68, that partially gave us the plenary situation with right now. I think we have to ask the question about the locker room talk, and we have to ask why is it that feminism feels so odious to so many women in this country? Why a feminist standing before them saying, I want to be the leader of this country, and this is my platform, is so repulsive, because I think it is a repulsion. This goes beyond, I think, laying out policies. And part of that is a desire to be inside the locker room. Because power is the locker room, power is that kind of sexual speech, joking around, or power is we can go back to, we haven't been immune from this before. Think about the beer summit when Professor Gates at Harvard was arrested trying to get into his own house because someone saw a black man breaking into a house in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The remedy for that, the common ground was attempted, was let's have beers together, we'll invite the cop, we'll invite the vice president, and we'll invite the president. No one invited the woman who called the cops and said there's a black man breaking into my neighbor's house. No one thought about what that sort of space looks like in terms of gender power. And these are I think, some of the questions we have to ask because it is a part of that reputation.
All right. I do want to leave time for questions, and so I know that you guys all have more to say, but we're going to have a chance to do that in response to questions. So at this point, I will turn it over to Q&A. If you do have a question, I'd ask you to come up and ask it to the microphone. I know that can be, a pain, but that would be helpful. So does anybody have a question?
Hi. First of all, thanks very much for this. This has been very interesting. I'm glad this didn't happen in the first place. But I have a concern. And my concern is that these same kind of analytical tools that failed time and time again for the past 18 months are the exact same tools that we are trying to impose on a situation that greatly exceeds the logic of conventional wisdom. So over the past 48 hours, we've been hearing the media ask the question, how do we get this wrong? And according to conventional wisdom, all of this doesn't fit. And Donald Trump as the anomaly has been recognized since he came out in the field. Now, how do we get to a point of transcending the limitations of the specialized logic that we've been using and failing to employ in terms of understanding, in quotes, this situation?
Yeah. So, I have a really direct answer to that because I really do. a Real Clear Politics essay that basically made a direct correlation, which if you go back all the way to Nixon, Eisenhower, Kennedy, I didn't trace it that far, but the more charismatic candidate wins to the public at large, right? If you look at even some of our more boring presidential candidates, and you come back to 2000, Bush and Gore, you're still the candidate who had a degree of authenticity in his or her charisma prevailed. And you know, one of the things that I'm really interested in your perspectives on is with respect to the reality not correlating with the science, the Bradley effect, the so-called Bradley effect, right? We studied in California, it's a black contender for governor. They said they would vote for him and did. So I frankly think, based on all the anecdotal evidence amassed in the reporting that I've done in the field, that you know, even these presumably feminist women at the Hewitt School in New York City, their first questions after the election were not about Hillary Clinton as a woman or as a feminist. There was more question, did the email scandal harm her? What, you know, so that is partly media norms in terms of shifting the discourse, and I think a lot of it was driven by clicks, by the entertainment moguls running the news division as opposed to, you know, a genuine commitment to public affairs. So that's kind of just taking the data out of it for a second and saying that it's not necessarily the character, the more upstanding character these days, as much as a perception of authenticity. He might be there, we talked about this, Trump, you know, to voters. Picture. Right, right. And the other thing that I've heard is it's better than being a liar or being dishonest. And the email scandal and the foundation, I think, more understandably struck a chord with folks. And I would just say that I don't view this, and you know, just again from the reporting that I've done on the ground, which has mostly been in the form of visiting with students from out of the United States this cycle, not formal reporting that I've done in previous cycles, but it doesn't seem to me that this is quite an indictment of feminism in the sense that if Elizabeth Warren had run and gotten the votes that Bernie Sanders did, she would have prevented the poaching of a lot of disaffected union vote. People who voted for President Obama and who were not just data crunching numbers, but out there, and you saw a whole host of people coming out from President Obama after the Bush presidency who were non-black, and who were white, Hispanic. So I said to these young women, you know, look at Elizabeth Warren, look at Claire McCaskill. You know, I don't know if you would consider them feminist leaders in the same sense. Certainly, you know, probably, yeah, just by virtue of accomplishment, but they don't really, at least McCaskill, maybe Warren more so, but I don't think either of them in their campaigns or in their careers have thought of themselves or have been portrayed as sort of iconic feminist leaders. But the point really is, and this is helpful for my context, how can we understand whether there was a Bradley effect, whether it applied to women and not people of color? When my operating premise going into the election was, sorry, I'm playing moderator now, was, you know, if President Obama could be elected, and the folks who are going to come out of the woodwork are simply not there or haven't been activated. We seem to activate them in order, they didn't prevent a black president, but they could elect someone who was endorsed by the KKK. So I'm just wondering how that.
So how do you guys want to? Or should we? Do you guys want to respond?
I have two thoughts at the same time. I must admit, the idea of the Bradley effect did occur to me. To what extent was it unacceptable to openly, particularly in a state like Connecticut, to what extent was it unacceptable to very overtly identify as a Trump supporter? Even on the day in which I cast my ballot, you saw the Republicans that were running for lower level offices not advertise, you know, while all the other Republican signs are up, what is conveniently absent, at least at my group, is the Trump sign. It's nowhere to be found. But you would think, since they're part of the same party,
You know, that wasn't the case for Clinton supporters and everyone else that was running for lower level offices here in Connecticut. To what extent were people politically conscious of maybe what may be at stake by openly admitting that they were supporting the candidate? I'm sure in some context it may have been totally acceptable. I'm a native of the state of Louisiana. The electoral outcome there was no surprise and shock to me. But I would say in the state of Connecticut, those numbers were a little too close, considering the breakdown. And there are, you know, one town over may be solidly red. You know, and here when you look at the map, you have Mansfield that's solidly blue, but next door was a Chaplain that's solidly red, which I don't know in this context that it was politically correct for you to be a very out, very front and center Trump supporter. And for that reason, people be less willing to admit to a pollster who they were willing to support until perhaps they exit, if they were willing to entertain the exit poll. At the same time, I think about the young man's question that took the microphone, and I think perhaps the American people were in denial, really. As many times as I heard my colleagues talk about how racist their family members were and how racist their friends were, we're coming out of an Obama era where the mantra was, we have transcended race. So to what extent do we come to grips with disbelief, whereby Trump was always underestimated, even by, I think, the Clinton campaign, regardless of what the polls said, how close they were. And I'll stop there.
No, I would say now I'm straying from the question as it was posed, but I do want to address the issue of feminism and if we had had a Clarence Haskell or Elizabeth Warren. And I think that that there are a variety of reasons, and many quite good not to vote for Hillary Clinton for president as a particular person, right? And there are many reasons to vote for Sanders. There are a variety of pieces. And I think we do have to talk about the outcomes of Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party of the 90s in a great way, right? And what this has done in terms of some yawning disparities in wealth in this country over time. But by the same token, we have the situation of emails, and I'm not rehashing the campaign itself, but we've got the emails and we've got the foundation, and this casts Hillary Clinton as a liar who cannot be trusted. How could you possibly have someone so corrupt in the White House? And then you make a list on the other side of the, I won't show you my taxes because who knows what's there. I won't pay people in the past. I won't. The list of things is so long. So then we have to, I think we have to ask the question, why is one a liar and one is speaking for the people? And in that dynamic, I look to her history as a feminist, I look to her gender, and I look to those responses that I think is she was talking about.
I want to say two things in response to Mick's comments. Trump, in my mind, comes to represent and epitomize what I call white capitalist patriarchy. He is the definition of manhood, right? Wealth, power, sexual conquest, trophy wife, you name it. He is the epitome of white masculine identity. That's it. On the flip side, I can remember a debate where he told Hillary Clinton that she didn't have the style of a president. And I think Elizabeth Warren, I think that woman has got swag. That woman she is a badass like Shirley Chisholm, 72. And forgive me for saying this, but it's because Hillary doesn't have the same swag that she can't draw in the millennials. Hillary Clinton, I think Trump to some extent got it right that she doesn't have quite the style. You know, forgive me, but Hillary reminds me of sort of your grandmother in a house dress with those funky slippers. And she doesn't have the quote-unquote presidential look that Trump was alluding to. She's a badass, but one in her own right. She is former Secretary of State. She's a senator from New York. She's brilliant. She's more than qualified to hold this position of commander-in-chief. But at the same time, the U.S. presidency is a highly masculine executive office for which Trump benefits. He has a masculine advantage over Hillary Clinton.
All right, so why don't we, I'm resisting jumping into this conversation myself because it is very, very interesting, and I hope you're finding it as well. I'm sure you are. But because of that, I also want to allow for another question.
Hello. So I have two questions. The first is,
Why don't we just start with the first one and we'll see it go.
well, the first one's kind of intuitive. In your class on Tuesday, the video
What happens in class stays in class.
Masculinities, hip hop used imagery of Donald Trump to convey exactly what you just said is the epitome of white male patriarchy. I was just wondering if you use that, if we watched that then in that specific video, if you were aware of that. That was the question.
Right. It had been a while since I had watched the documentary Beyond Big Salon.
Yeah.
But it did fit rather nicely.
Yeah.
You know, it is a short clip
It was
in
very
the
short.
documentary, and I did think, oh wow, how timely is that, and how appropriate. But to answer your question, I had shown it, and I had forgotten that he did in fact have an appearance
Yeah.
in that documentary.
Yeah. So I just thought that was funny.
So
And-
very quickly.
Yeah, so my question is, as you both have said, the presidency is, a position of power in a patriarchal system, so it's going to, kind of perpetuate masculine structures, and as well as the media is unwilling to address class. And so I'm wondering if within this two-party system, if it's possible to have a real discourse, because we're so far away from, on both sides, the actual drivers of inequality and unwilling to recognize structural racism. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, structural racism and discourse. Anybody want to take that up?
Well, I'll just say with respect to the two-party system, the anecdote that I revealed from the outset, I think, very much substantiates that. You all have to imagine politics as not D's and R's, and it may not have always been that we had to reimagine the structure, but we have to now in order to get the discourse that our founders,
It's a live question whether there are D's and R's, as some of us
Yeah,
understand
right. Well, that's
right now.
true.
I mean, I think that's an open question, and that's right.
we certainly need a viable third party, and that's what I was saying. I said if there had been a Ted Sorensen or a young aide whispering into John Case's ear, you need to do this as a third party. Your own bold moves, Clinton will win, but this will form the beginnings of a viable, more like a parliamentary system. I think it's necessary because value systems are colliding, and right now we have no idea how Trump is going to govern. It's wrapped in so many contradictions, so that you don't really have two parties with clear agendas anymore. So how could they possibly lay the groundwork for reasoned discourse when they don't know what they represent anymore too?
Right. We don't know what we're going to be talking about.
Well, I think this has been a persistent a persistent conversation. I think back to Nader, think back to a variety of moments when Thoreau, when you have sort of a third-party challenge that starts to carry or gather more steam and impact. By the same token, I think we have to worry also in this where the Ds and where the Rs and what do they look like, not allowing the incredible extremes of this election cycle to make odious things appear to be the center because the edges are so extreme. And I think that's a real risk that we have.
So maybe we should move, do we have some more questions? Maybe we should move right on to the next question. Go ahead.
Thank you. Appreciate the conversation here. Just had a quick question for you. Beginning of this conversation, you said, and I was standing in the back, so I may have heard you wrong, about the reaction of protesting in front of Trump Towers versus it being more impactful to run for office or something of that nature. Did I quote you right?
In effect, the spirit of it, yeah. Roll up your sleeves and find the answer, which, yeah.
And I totally agree about pushing forward. If anything that this election has taught us is that we need to lean in, right? And not just wait till we get in our older, more seasoned era of being in our 40s, that at 20, I'm trying to sing that out. That at 20, one thing that I always like, is probably just because of the work that I do, is that some of the best leaders of change have not been over 20, right? Like the 20, like this age group that we have here on this campus. But the reason why I asked you the question is because I absolutely agree that more of us need to be involved in the political process. But I think when you elect someone that has so much promise of removing people from the political process, that does incite protest. It's time to just get it out. And I can appreciate protest that has happened over the last 20, 48 hours to get that out. Because people are in fear. Certainty is real, uncertainty is real. Future doesn't look that bright. But I do encourage those in this room and on this campus to lean into the process. Once you get your anger out, I get it, right? To lean in. But the voice has to be heard.
Right, sometimes that protest is a prerequisite.
So, you know, I respect the protest.
Yeah.
Really quick, last question is just the fact that talking about the Hillary campaign, I literally have been reflecting on this, that the idea that she was to mobilize the Obama coalition and where she may have gone wrong. I think that there was this expectation that people who showed up for him in 2008 and 2012 were just going to automatically show up. And I think that there were some missed opportunities for her to really dig in and mobilize some of those communities. One, I'm going to just speak on it. I think her outreach to Black women failed miserably. That Black women were over, and Dr. Simien, you can get me right, but like 90% with Obama in 2008 and 2012 showed up to put him in office as the largest kind of group. And I don't recall not one type of meeting with the Congressional Caucus on Black women and girls, not one meeting on these college campuses with women of color. And I'm just trying to figure out that why I am deeply saddened that she did not win. I also can be honest about the fact that I'm not sure she knew how to mobilize that coalition. And I think that that was a real miss on her part. That the women of color that showed up for Obama, like they showed up for her, if you look at the numbers, right? They showed up for her and she missed it again. And I just don't know if anyone saw that or thought about that, but I was really interested in getting some feedback.
Great, thank you. All right, so, Marks?
It's funny because I immediately start thinking about your first book on Mammy, and I think because she is a white woman, she's got to put in some additional work. And it's got to go beyond, she got some hot sauce in her bag, referencing Beyonce. It's got to go a step further than the symbolic. So when you say, how does she, in a meaningful way, then reach out to and appeal to Black women? One question I often got was, what would a Hillary Clinton win mean for not just white women, but women of color? And is there, in fact, a disconnect? To some extent, you know, Hillary Clinton can come to represent sort of Miss Ann. You know, to quote sort of Melissa Harris Perry in an older publication of hers, she talked about this reluctance on the part of Black women to support yet another privileged white woman who could be complicit in their own oppression, sort of juxtaposing her with the white female mistress on a plantation. And so not to reduce us to a supportive mammy role. And is that in the 21st century what we in fact saw via her efforts to appeal to Black women? They were largely symbolic versus substantive. When she's putting together her package or her plan, there's no direct talk to Black women and their needs, no specificity when it comes down to women of color. Yes, she talks about women and girls, those that are poor and underprivileged and wards of the state, as she discloses her narrative, right, at the Democratic Convention. But there is really no highlight, no substantive mention of what her record has done for Black women in this country. It's sold as more generically benefiting women, generally speaking. And, you know, oftentimes we equate women with white women, unless we specify Black and brown women, who are perhaps the most loyal Democratic voters. And it's the women that she could not rely upon for the ones she actually descriptively represents.
Can I quickly? Yep. So we'll just do a little mutual love association here, because all I could think about was your book and the data that shows exactly that, right? That it is women of color across a range of identifications that were supportive of these candidates, and we saw that again this last cycle. And I think in terms of picking up the pieces, we have to take this to the next place is, how do we have these conversations that actually deal with structural racism, that actually deal with the differences among a variety of women, families, men, in the same way that what we have seen is a current sort of part of the Republican Party mobilizing exactly some of these racial conversations around whiteness, right? And so I think that we need to identify those, spotlight them, and also work on exactly sort of having these conversations instead of assuming that the folks who always turn out for the Democrats will always turn for the Democrats. And that's not just about party politics, that's about our national life. I mean, that's the conversation.
Wow. Okay.
Lois, under the mic, please. Sorry. My question is also about the concordance with electoral politics for the information. And really, that when you spoke about keeping it in mind and about forgiveness, I guess I'm curious about how we reconcile that with self-respect. Because Evelyn, you use that lovely analogy of the abusive relationship, and this is in some sense what it feels like to wake up in the morning and discover that. There are people in this country who either kind of feel antagonistic towards people like me or are willing to overlook these kind of direct violence and towards people like me. So how do we engage, should we engage in the local community with people who refuse to see us as equals? Can we maintain our self-respect and engage in that kind of conversation?
Well, piggybacking on that and the question, these exchanges and the prior question, Well, there's a real question about the Democratic Party strategy now with respect to identity politics. Do you double down on them after what was really a tremendous failure in not realizing the potential of the demographics? People say demographics are destiny. Well, they probably could have been for Secretary Clinton. A combination of a outreach that catered more to, I'm sorry to say it, maybe in part what the previous questioner was saying, but the folks Bernie was celebrating in his movement. Had Sanders been on the ticket, you might have addressed some of the electoral divide even more decisively than if she had, Secretary Clinton, appealed more or differently to people of color or women of color. And I would just say, from someone who monitored the campaign pretty closely, I thought she did dive into, it made her campaign essentially a question of character and whether you or not you believe in America that she was adopting as her own. And I thought maybe it's symbolism and imagery in terms of the portrait and the rallies and the kinds of people who were there and the kinds of things that she was saying. And she was certainly a late adopter of criminal justice reform. And maybe women of color remember the Clinton years as not as friendly to minorities, and that was a real disadvantage in a political context. But I would say, just importantly, with respect to the protests now, of course, if you're going to be angry and want to do it in constructive protest, civil disobedience, amen to you and to your friends and to anyone in this room. But just remember, it was the same kind of boycott approach, an approach to SNL when Donald Trump was hosting, and the beginning of normalizing bigotry in our discourse, when folks thought that would be sufficient and carry weight in how we think about it. So I would think carefully as voters, but as Americans, in terms of how you extricate yourself from what seems to be an electoral predicament that a lot of Democrats are going to be in now. Because identity politics is not really necessarily an immediate solution as much as constitutional politics, constitutional reform. And that is maybe too deep, it may be too deep with respect to gerrymandering and the Electoral College and other things that will forever diminish the urban center. But my sense is that a candidate, even not as flawed as Secretary Clinton, could not just espouse and envision a diverse America and win. I mean, that was clear. That's clear. Her brand of generic, I think you said it best, generic pluralism failed. There aren't enough people outraged by the explicit and or implicit exhibitions of bigotry, whatever we call it.
So we are, I'm afraid, running out of time. We have run out of time. But I still want to get, I think, the last question, we will want to touch on the issue of respect and discourse. If we have anything that we want to add on that, the last remarks, I guess.
I'm thinking on a question, honestly. I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about her question about going forward in my analogy of a relationship. Because I'm sitting here processing and thinking, it's not like we have any choice. We can't exit, we can't abandon, we can't file for divorce tomorrow unless you want to leave the United States, right? And so I think you ask a really difficult question. How do we make the most of our current circumstance? Oftentimes we ask women, why don't you just leave? Well, we don't have that choice. And so we're presented with a problem, and we have to think creatively, how do we get over or around, how, in what way within my immediate circumstance might I change this system? And for some, it is the catalyst that's needed to take on, let's say, a more active role in political life. And we may not, unseat Donald Trump tomorrow, but perhaps we can feel good about what individual efforts we make that contribute to a larger collective movement in this country.
Time over to, we have a couple folks standing online. Is there
Okay, all right, so just we'll have to keep it very, very, very short.
Thank you. My name is Jessica. I'm a trans woman. I'm going to share a couple very first stories that I think explain what I'm going to ask. Talking about my mom, who identifies as a feminist, second wave. She refuses to, acknowledge my illness and speaks of biological essentialism and basically said that people should be afraid of me for who I am. Going forward, she also just completely ignores or supports somehow my dad in saying that white men get back into power as if they ever left. And I'm just wondering how someone can go about helping educate someone to start seeing the problems of older second wave feminism and bring them to a more complete understanding of how gender, one, works, and two, plays into power politics and oppression and the like.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you. And I think that this, you started tonight by talking about we have to have courage of our convictions and courage to speak back to these issues. And part of it, we have to have the courage to be visible and keep ourselves visible, right? The courage to go up to the mic and tell our stories and demand that we be seen. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that people are trying not to allow folks to be seen and heard. So I think that courage of conviction and still putting ourselves out there, whether it's as people running for office or as people in the streets demanding that rage be acknowledged, that there is real anger that has to be recognized. The conversations in terms of complicating our wider understandings of gender also require all of those same kinds of activism and hard personal conversations, I know, with people we love, right? And that's, I think, something that this entire election highlights. My whole family's from Kentucky, and I was raised in Idaho. Most of my family voted very differently and feels very differently than I do, but I love them, and trying to negotiate those things is really hard. So not a full answer, but it's I appreciate it.
Okay, one last question, and again, keep in mind forward.
I was wondering where coded language fits into this idea because a lot of the ideas, a lot of the racism and sexism and nativism is a word that does not mean American politics. They're not used to American.
Very interesting, the starkness of the discourse. It is an interesting note on which to end, because I think, a lot of talk about dogmas in American politics. There certainly was a lot of that. But there was, as the question points out. Really was dogmas, it was thrown away. Does that mark a shift, or is it just a return to something that has always been there? Any comment on that?
Politics is the art of the possible. Now it's just sort of the status quo. We have to be entertained in order to be informed. And I think that more than anything else in the media's perpetuation of that could be. You know, if you want your political news to be as fulfilling from that perspective, there is a degree to which the lines will blur, and it's not Jon Stewart. It's really the commercial impulse of the news divisions that you know, I think we're part of that vicious cycle of normalizing not just the whistle, but the graphic nature of it, and that's why I've called for a more deliberative, not democracy and the deliberative news making and dissemination of information. And we haven't talked at all about the role of technology this election cycle, but a tremendously adverse one with respect to the application of the responsibility on the part of Silicon Valley. Google did some, but Facebook and Twitter absolutely were giving unmitigated microphone, unmitigated bigotry that was not censored and not controlled and not edited. And just how many folks didn't vote in North Carolina because they saw a tweet that said you could text the number because of the proliferation of political trolls and bots, Hillary to XYZ. I'm a friend of a recent guest to be is the leading expert on political bots. So it's not just the dog whistling, it's the way in which it's been normalized, and then the opposite of whistling is the very graphic shouting, but the graphic tolerance of that kind of misinformation is also this usually animating those demons in of our racist past. And so kind of, I've called it, with respect to Facebook and just the extent to which the ratings have become the clicks, the monetization of fraud, with respect to political news. So don't any of you leave here thinking that it was a candidate alone who was flawed. Mark Zuckerberg and the folks who are on Twitter should be doing the autopsy. It was said that Republicans did the autopsy and, you know, did the opposite, reverting to white power politics. Well, let's hope the Silicon Valley folks actually rein in social media, because it's not an analog to civil society right now.
On that note, we are going to have to bring this forum to an end. Thank you so much for joining us. If you want to, this will be put up on YouTube afterwards. Please follow the project at Public Humility. You can also go to the Meetings Institute website, find out about the activism and community projects that we're engaged in. Thank you very much. Thank you.